So class, the physiology of the female reproductive system. Oogenesis, the process of which female gametes, or ovum, are produced. It differs from spermatogenesis in the following ways. It begins before the female infant is born, which is crazy to think about. Essentially, as you are developing in the womb, you are already doing oogenesis, compared to men, which actually start during puberty. Now, it begins before the female infant is born and is suspended until puberty. Once reactivated at puberty, it continues until it ceases operation at menopause, somewhere on average between 45 and 55 years of age. It occurs about once per month, and it is part of the ovarian cycle. So, before birth, female stem cells, oogonia, complete their mitotic function. Remember, mitotic. That is, remember what all somatic cells can do, and that is essentially how can cells produce identical reproductive copies of each other. It is different from meiosis, where you are going to produce non-identical daughter cells. Now, meiosis 1 begins between the 3rd and 7th month of fetal development, and these are going to produce primary oocytes. In childhood, primary oocytes remain in prophase 1 and do not develop any further until meiosis resumes after puberty, when specific hormone levels trigger the initiation of the ovarian cycle. Puberty to menopause. Approximately once a month, 20 to 30 primary oocytes are stimulated to continue development. A larger cell, the secondary oocytes, contains DNA and most of the cytoplasm, has the potential to become an ovum. So, every month, about 20 to 30 primary oocytes are tapped to start continuing development. Secondary oocytes are starting to form, and these potentially can become the ovum. The secondary oocytes proceeds to metaphase 2, and the development again is arrested. If fertilized, the secondary oocyte will complete its second mitotic division and then divide to form a second polar body and an ovum. Let's look at this in a photo and let's talk a little bit about polar bodies. Now, polar bodies are essentially when an egg divides. One is going to be greedy and one is essentially going to be sacrificed. Now, I have a photo. I looked a little bit for a photo, but this is actually good. So you can see a clear size difference between this one and this one. The primary oocyte to secondary oocyte, as it undergoes meiosis, one of those are going to take the lion's share of the cytoplasm. While the genetic is similar between the two in terms of the amount of nucleus and DNA that is stored there, one of them is going to get the lion's share of the cytoplasm and one of them is just condemned to death. That one that's condemned is the polar body. It also happens again after fertilization occurs, where, hey, we're going to start dividing, we need to throw away some of the extra material, but we're taking all the cytoplasm and all the goodies. This is a really unique mechanism, and polar bodies are created because of it, and just think about it as essentially dump stuff. Because of that, you can see here, there's a saying, sperm is cheap, eggs are expensive. Why is that? Well, both spermatogenesis and oogenesis produce gametes and provide the same amount of genetic material. However, their gametes play very different roles in reproduction. Sperm is produced in high numbers for two reasons. One, most of them are not going to make it. They have to travel through the inhospitable female reproductive tract, and majority of them are not going to survive. It only takes one sperm to make it and penetrate the ovum for fertilization to occur. So more sperm entering the reproductive tract means more sperm are going to make it to the secondary oocyte. The next thing kind of invalidates or changes the narrative on a common phrase or saying, where it's like, well, you were first the first time in your life. Like, you're a winner. You made it to the egg first. You were born for greatness, kind of a thing. Not really. I hate to take the wind out of your sails, but the enzyme that allows sperm to penetrate the secondary oocyte is more than one sperm required. One sperm itself cannot penetrate one cannot produce enough enzyme to penetrate. You need hundreds of sperm to actually make it to the oocyte, and that enzyme starts degenerating the protective wall around it to allow one sperm to make it through to fertilize. In contrast, there is no reason for the female reproductive system to produce multiple ova at one time. It has a difficult time of supporting more than 2 or 3 embryos during a pregnancy, and so this is one of the reasons why ovums are produced very, very in low numbers compared to sperm, which is produced in very, very high numbers. In addition, we'll talk about this a little bit later when we're talking about later in life aging and everything, but women have a limited number of eggs, primary follicles that were done before you were even born, and menopause essentially happens when you are running out, or when you run out of eggs and you are no longer able to continue the ovarian cycle in the same exact way. Compared to men, because sperm is cheap and everything, and we don't have a stock in the same way, men will continue to produce fertile sperm for much, much longer. Here is essentially a table summarizing what I just talked about, and it divides it up between the characteristic, spermatogenesis, and oogenesis. So spermatogenesis, time of onset, begins at puberty. For oogenesis, this occurs before birth, and primary oocytes get arrested at prophase 1 until puberty. For puberty, for spermatogenesis, this begins and continuously produces sperm cells. Meiosis resumes, the primary oocyte is stimulated into mature to a secondary oocyte each month. And as you can see, it just goes down the list of everything that I talk about. This is a really good slide if you want to compare the differences and try to chart the path through. I'm a huge fan of actually taking this and then either erasing the inside, or I think what I would do is I would insert a shape, put a box there, study it, put a box, see if you're able to list out what happens at spermogenesis, at puberty, at the result of meiosis, when the process ends. Do it for oogenesis. It's a good way to actually test your knowledge to make sure that you know what's happening. All right, class, we're now getting into the physiology of the female reproductive system. Now, it's going to look confusing, but there's going to be divided up into 3 sections. We're going to talk about the female ovarian cycle, essentially what is the process of them making their gametes, their ovums, how is that going to work? The next step is how is that going to be controlled by hormones that essentially create that menstrual cycle, or the 28 days where essentially you will release and create an egg. Then on top of it, we'll go deeper into the menstrual cycle and try to see, okay, how do the hormones that both create the ovum being released stack with the uterus preparing to receive a fertilized zygote, and what happens if it does receive a fertilized zygote, essentially pregnancy occurs, or if it doesn't, and then you have the sloughing off of the uterine walls, creating what is commonly called as the period. Now, let's jump into the female ovarian cycle. Estrogens and progesterones are involved in a multi-tiered negative feedback loop that includes the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary gland, and ovaries. Now, we talked about this previously in the male section where it was the HPG axis. Remember, the hypothalamus, H, pituitary gland, P, and gonads, G. In the males, it was testes. In the females, it is ovaries. However, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are similar. The regulation of female hormone system is complex, and it requires rhythmic fluctuations of hormones. Now, let's get into it because it is fascinating. The oocyte develops inside an ovarian follicle. These are small blister-like structures within the ovarian cortex. And the really fascinating thing about this is a lot of it actually occurs before birth. So before you are outside, take your first breath and everything, females are constantly creating primordial follicles. These are going to be the first follicles formed in the fetus that contain one primary oocyte. Childhood. Most primordial follicles have died through the process called apoptosis, essentially programmed cell death. Some of the remaining primordial follicles grow into primary follicles. Primordial, primary. So later we can take note and take a list, but you can see it essentially here, and it goes in a specific order. I would put where this occurs and what it is. So like primordial follicle is when you are in a fetus and you are rapidly producing as many eggs as you are going to have throughout your lifetime. Childhood, a lot of them are going to die through apoptosis, programmed cell death. Either the ovary can't support all the ones that you have currently created, or it essentially is selecting the ones that are the best chance of making it. Now, some of them grow into primordial follicles as oocytes enlarge and develop into secondary follicles containing arrested primary oocytes. Now, arrested is not that they committed a crime and they're in jail and they're essentially waiting, but it is similar to arrested where their progress is stopped. In childhood, these follicles have to be arrested because, one, you haven't gone through puberty, so you don't have the essentially body to support those oocytes. And if not, you would essentially just be tossing eggs into the wind. They wouldn't be able to stick, they wouldn't be able to get fertilized. It would be essentially a waste of all of the work that the body is trying to do. Puberty to menopause. At this point, one secondary follicle grows into a mature follicle, or a vesicular follicle, tertiary, about once per month. This contains a secondary oocyte arrested in metaphase 2. The body doesn't want to release a ton of eggs at once because that's wasteful. In humans, there is more of a chance that you are going to not have a huge clutch of litter like a rat or a cat or other animals. As you get up in the evolutionary tree, chances are the offspring that the body can actually produce decreases. These are due to a variety of reasons, but some of the highlights are uniovularity, where some animals will release a lot of eggs. Humans typically release one during a traditional cycle. There's an extended child rearing compared to other animals where I believe giraffes and deer, fawns are able to, as soon as they come out, able to walk. In humans, they're essentially useless for a long period of time. In addition, you have cognitive complexity. A large brain and complex issues require a longer necessarily developed pyramid. So for all of these reasons, or theories, this is one of the reasons why, as you get higher up in the evolutionary tree, organisms seem to have less offspring compared to lower in the tree. And another thing that I forgot to mention is rate of survival or rate of success. Animals that have a large clutch of them typically assume that they're going to lose some of them. So to continue to propagate the species, they produce a lot of offspring with the evolutionary acceptance that some of them are not going to make it. In humans, it's a lot different because we put a lot of energy, effort, and time into maintaining that human, like all of us here. Regardless, the vesicular follicle ruptures, resulting in ovulation of a secondary oocyte. Now, let's just very quickly recap. We have the primordial follicle, secondary follicle, primordial follicle, primary follicle, secondary follicle, vesicular follicle. follicle. And then ovulation occurs, where this is essentially where ovulation occurs, where this follicle is essentially ruptured due to the increasing pressure and fluid inside of it, and this ovulated secondary oocyte is ejected out of it and starts heading towards the fallopian tubes. Now, the interesting thing, we're going to talk a little bit more about later, is that this ruptured follicle, this vesicular follicle, will actually turn into the corpus luteum. And this is the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. This corpus luteum will actually start secreting progesterone and some estrogen, and it is dependent, or the survival of the corpus luteum is dependent on if you get pregnant or not. If you do get pregnant, that corpus luteum is going to stay around and continue to secrete hormones to support that growing embryo. If you do not get pregnant, that corpus luteum is essentially going to degenerate and turn into scar tissue of the corpus albicans. Get ahead of myself though. So, ovulation, vesicular follicle erupts from the ovary wall into the peritoneal cavity, ejecting its secondary oocyte and its granulosa layer, called the corona radia. So, all of these steps led to ovulation, popped out. We are now in the luteal phase, stages 6 through 7. This ruptured follicle becomes an endocrine organ called the corpus luteum. The yellowish is formed by the remaining granulosa cells and thecal cells, secreting progesterone and some estrogen, and will persist about 3 months and then degrade if pregnancy does not occur. The corpus albicans is the whitish knot of scar tissue that marks the end of one ovarian cycle. The remnants of previously active corpus luteum after ceasing secreting hormones and is digested by macrophages. You can see it here as well as on the histology. These are all of the steps for the stages of the ovarian cycle, and the whole purpose of this is to make ovums, make gametes. It is a much more intense, complicated, and interesting process than going all the way back up to the man, then spermatogenesis. And we're just getting started. So now let's head back down. And tie a little knot on it. The ovarian cycle averages about 28 days overall, with each stage accounting for some amount of time. The follicular phase, where we're taking these follicles that were arrested and ready to be selected to move forward to actually produce and have that oocyte ejected out of the ovary, takes about 14 days. The luteal phase is the 14 through 28 days. That's relatively constant, mostly because of the corpus luteum secreting a certain level of estrogen and progesterone, as well as the body is trying to prepare to either get pregnant or, if not pregnant, start the cycle all over again. This is all of it in a single slide and photo where you can go step by step by step. What I'm asking you guys to do, you don't have to print it, but I want you to say, okay, the primordial follicles, when are they produced? Primary follicles to secondary follicles. What has to happen in terms of age, in terms of hormones, in terms of things to get there? When does that stop in terms of when are they arrested at what stage, and then when are they reactivated, depending on hormones? We haven't gotten to that section yet. It's coming up, but this is just to prime you to go back to this and start writing them down.